Welcome to Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater. Issues and Answers is presented as a public service to New Mexicans by State Employees Credit Union, who have been proudly serving the families of New Mexico locally and abroad since 1958. State Employees Credit Union is ready to help you and your family with all your financial goals. And now, Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater.
Welcome to the program. I'm Diane Kinderwater. Who doesn't enjoy reading a Western novel or going seeing a Western movie or a Western TV show? Bonanza, The Rifleman. What about John Wayne? Who hasn't seen him? Reading a Western novel, it's really pretty much just you in the book. Going to a Western movie, it's just maybe you in a dark movie theater. But what if you like to share Western history, New Mexico Western history, old New Mexico, with others? Well, I have a group for you. You can get together with folks who love talking about New Mexico and its very vibrant history. The name of the group is called the New Mexico Westerners. On the show today, we're going to discuss this group and how in the past they were able to meet at various hotels and restaurants and get together and maybe talk to an author, listen to an educator, a historian, maybe listen to some Western music, all together in a group, having a grand old time talking about the Old West. Of course, with COVID, things have changed, but there's still a way to get involved with others who, like you and like me, love talking about New Mexico and its past. So please stay with us as we discuss the New Mexico Westerners right after this. Of course, most of us who live here in New Mexico love it for some reason, either the culture, the weather. I love the weather. The sunsets, the sunrises, the sky, the bright blue sky. We all have various reasons we love this state. But what about the history? Do you love talking about the history? Well, I'm not sure if you'll love it as much as my guests today, because they are the president and vice president of New Mexico Westerners. And Don Bullis, you are the founder of this group.
Well, not founder. It's been around since 1956 in New Mexico.
Well, you could have okay.
And I'm old, but I'm not that old. But I've been the president for the last 19 years. And so it's a group we have that it's about 100 people. We meet 9 times a year. We don't meet in the summertime. We meet in the evening, and we meet at the Ramada on Manal near University. Excuse me. Used to be the MCM Elegante, and before that, talking about history, it was the old Holiday Inn when it was originally built, way back in probably the 70s. In any event, the organization, Westerners International, started in Chicago back in the early 50s. The group started here, as I said, in the later 50s. Originally, it was about 10 or 15 guys that got around and sat around and talked about New Mexico history. Most of them were journalists or other kinds of writers and so forth. But over the years, it's evolved. When I took over, we had about 50 members. As our last count, we have 100 members now. Now, after COVID, I don't know. We haven't met for over a year, so there could be
Are you doing online things, Joe?
No, we're not doing
Not doing online at this point. So Joe Brown is a newbie. I mean, you haven't been part of the group for 19 years, but for quite a while. So tell me about your involvement, Joe Brown.
Well, for 7 or 8 years, my wife and I have been members and have loved it. And over the past couple of years, I've agreed to be his vice. And
Vice president of the group, okay?
Yes, and if he needs a break, I've agreed that I could give him a break. So, but that's a future thing.
Joe, how did you hear about the group?
It was through Western music. We set up a couple of programs with a gallery in Old Town, and the owner of that gallery was a member of the Westerners. And he and his wife invited my wife and I to come to a Westerners meeting. we haven't missed one since.
And we're going to talk about why
Okay.
that is, but getting back to what draws you to meeting. Again, we can read the books, we can see the movies, watch the TV shows, but there's a difference about coming together. And Don Bullis, you are an award-winning author and so much more, if that's not enough. Tell me a little bit about your background here in New Mexico and the books you've written and how getting together with this group means a lot to the group.
Well, I graduated from Eastern New Mexico University in 1970. I hate to realize that that's more than 50 years ago. But my first job was with the American Automobile Association, and I was the editor of their publication, which was called the New Mexico Motorist. And so I began writing about New Mexico then. And it's really never stopped. Now, along the way, I've done other things. I did a 20-year career in New Mexico law enforcement. I've edited newspapers. I taught school, taught at the college level. But the Westerners was just a perfect fit. It's the people there, there are absolutely no pretenses at all. In fact, we say, leave your stuffed shirt at home, because we're just a very casual group, but we bring in the top people on various subjects of New Mexico history, people that make good presentations. We don't have professorial dissertations on the standard deviation of wool production in the 1860s. We don't deal with that sort of thing. But we do have I did a program, I've done it several times, on law and order in the frontier New Mexico, for instance. Our last program before COVID got us was Robert Martinez, who's our state historian, and he did a piece on New Mexico folk music, and he's a pretty good singer, so it was really an interesting program. But that's an example of the variety of talks we do. One of our speakers, B.G. Burr, who sadly passed away, but he did a Chautauqua on Ernie Pyle, who was the famous newsman that lived here in Albuquerque during World War II. But that's an example of when we have fun. The idea is to sit down, we have a cocktail hour for a half an hour, and then we have a sit-down dinner. That's a provision. And then we have our program and a question and answer period afterwards, always. So we're always capable of accommodating just about anybody, any point of view, and so forth. We have no limitations on who can join. You'll be happy to know that there was early a limitation that women couldn't be a part of it, but that changed about 30 years ago.
You're joking. You're not joking.
I'm not joking.
You're not joking.
No, when it was first organized, it was just men. They had one meeting a year when they could invite their wives, but other than that, they didn't. But that's been changed, and we've had several female presidents in the years since. So that's history.
So to become a member, what do you need to do? Just love history, love New Mexico?
What you really need, most important thing as far as we're concerned, is the dues, which is $15 a year.
If you got $15 burning in your pocket, you can be a member.
And you're in, right?
Oh, how funny!
And we don't maintain a large treasury. We do a newsletter informing members who the speaker is going to be, and we even send out the menu for each coming meeting and so forth. And occasionally we go on road trips. We had one road trip where we went up to the Glorieta battlefield and then Fort Union. We had another one. We went to Los Lunas and went through the store down there, the old stores and so forth. So we do that to accommodate our members, and it's just a pleasant time. We have no political leanings one way or the other. There's no religious preferences. We have, for members, we have an astronaut. Mike Mullane's one of our members. We have attorneys, the Kelleher people. In fact, the Kellehers were early members of the Westerners, and Mike still attends meetings on a regular basis. A lot of educators. We've had college professors. Still have quite a few writers that attend regularly. And it's just a chance for everybody to get together and share their latest news and so on.
And And Joe, I mean, you've lived in other parts of the country, but the New Mexico West, and I've lived in New Mexico for many years now, and El Paso as well, but when I came from Minnesota originally down here, and it's been over 35 years, people just say it's just unique in the world. Germans, Europeans love to come to El Paso, Las Cruces, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, because there's no place like it. And our history is no place like our history.
Absolutely. I know that my wife and I loved this place before we retired out of Southern California, where we previously lived for over 30 years. It was not hard to move here. Now, full disclosure, we had a son here with some small grandchildren of ours, so
That would be a good reason to come. That's a pretty good reason
they were
to
a pretty
draw.
good magnet too. But we were happy to move here, and I've always loved history. As a matter of fact, shoot, in the 5th grade, I won the history award, and it's never changed. I've always loved it. But this place is extremely special for all the things that happened in what's commonly known as the Old West that you see in the movies. A lot of that happened here. So I love it. I do love it. And the culture is very Western as well. And that's wonderful. And I wouldn't move at this point. Let's just say that.
As part of as the vice president and part of the New Mexico Westerners, Joe Brown, what do you get out of the group compared to reading the novel, reading a book, reading a history book, going to a lecture at the university? What's different about this group?
Well, first off, my wife and I have actually talked about this recently. Our presentations that Don talked about, there hasn't been a dud, really. And why do I say that? Because you're in an environment to where the person that presenting it, the author that wrote the book, the professor that wrote the thesis, or the historian that did the work, you can talk. They give you that question and answer period. And that means so much to those of us that are curious. Well, okay, you talked about this. What prompted you to go in that direction? Now, do you see that kind of question? You can't ask that of a book. You can't ask that of a movie. But you can, at the Westerners, ask the person that created what you're talking about.
I'd ask,
Isn't that-
there's so much, but
There-
I'd ask, and maybe you can answer, what's the real true history of Billy the Kid? Is he?
He can do that.
Well, I mean, is he buried here? Is
I have to tell you that I generally make a point of not talking about Billy the Kid, but
Since I asked,
but suffice it to say this: anything that you read about him in popular literature, you can pretty well depend on the fact that it's wrong. There's very little, and the reason for that is that there's very little really known about him. No one knows for sure where or when he was born. They're not quite sure how old he was. Pat Garrett wrote a book in 1881 or 82 called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. And most of it's wrong, but the legend is based on that book. For instance, they allege that he killed 21 men in his 21 years of life. Chances are he killed 4, maybe 5, nowhere near 21. It was also part of the legend was that number didn't include Mexicans and Indians, quote, unquote. There's no evidence that he ever killed even one Mexican or one Indian. I mean, so the whole thing has just been blown out, but it makes for great movies.
but where is he buried?
Oh, he's buried at Fort Sumner. There's no question about that. I mean, let me take that back. There are several people who have written books that claim that he didn't die there, killed by Pat
Or he's not
Garrett.
dead yet, like Elvis Presley. He's not. He's still not. He's not dead.
Exactly
Okay.
right. It's just so. But he is, as many historians say, he's our. If we've got a state cookie, which is the best bizcochito. If we had a state outlaw, it would have to be Billy the Kid. So, yeah, he gets a lot of attention, and some say, well, that's good because people come here partly over curiosity about him. They go to the town of Lincoln. They do the the tour and so forth.
But and we're not going to stay too much with Billy the Kid, but Don Bullis, someone who has lived here, who's written about it, who has studied our history. And we hear so many different stories and rumors. What is the best source? If the Garrett book from 1881 isn't a good actual source of information, true information, what is?
Well, in the case of Billy the Kid, there's been so much written about him and the Lincoln County War. I have a space on my bookshelf at home. It's easily 3 feet long. That's nothing but books about Billy and the Lincoln County War. So I can't say that. There are a couple that are better than others. Will Kelleher wrote a book called Violence in Lincoln County, which is a pretty good source. There's an Englishman by the name of Fred Nolan that's written a half a dozen books about Billy, which are pretty good to try and cut through the legend and get down to the story.
So you feel pretty assured that those might be true.
If you really want to understand the whole phenomena, you need to read several books, because there's all kinds of points.
Okay.
Strangely enough, Billy the Kid becomes very, very popular when economic times are hard. When there's prosperity, Billy the Kid becomes very unpopular. That can be shown historically, that his popularity goes up and down based on the nation's economy.
Isn't that interesting? And you, again, as an award-winning author and historian, you are a New Mexico Centennial author. What does that mean?
The state library had a program in 2011 when we were coming up and celebrating our centennial in 2012. And they selected several people to represent the state as authors. I was the author. Levi Romero was the poet. I'm trying to think. Vonda Nelson was the children's author. The centennial writer was Scott Momaday, who's a Native American author who's very, very well known. And the idea was that we were to help promote the state based on our own particular areas and so forth. Now, it's sad to say that the state leadership decided not to spend any money on celebrating our centennial, and so not much was done, and it was kind of a disappointment. But it was still, I still consider it an honor to have been named centennial author.
Fantastic. And in addition to that, you've written a number of columns. Currently, do you still live in Rio Rancho?
Yes.
But you wrote for the New Mexico Observer and a number of other publications.
Yeah.
So you know what you're talking about. You know what you're writing about.
Well, I do it anyway. It's up to you to decide whether I know what I'm talking about or not.
Oh, how fun. Is it a requirement to wear a cowboy hat to the
absolutely not.
to the Westerner meeting? No.
We don't always, but we do often. But no, it is not the history of this state and all that it stands for would go far beyond the cowboy hat, if you will. And there are people in the Westerners that have never been on a range. Now, I grew up in Oklahoma, actually, and one of my cousins is still on a range, so, but it's not a requirement by any means. But the folks in the Westerners typically enjoy all things about the Old West.
How fortunate we are to have that. What else would you like to share about our Western history? Not just your group. Our folks they know how to reach you. I think we have a website
Yes.
and a newsletter. If they start ponying up their $15, they get the newsletter. How often does that come out, Don?
Well, it just comes out every month that we're going to have a meeting. We send it out 2 weeks before the meeting, so 9 times a year. But in terms of history in general, since I have an audience, New Mexico unfortunately does a really terrible job of teaching history in its schools. Our schools do almost nothing on New Mexico history, and it's an incredibly interesting history. It dates back, when you think about it, New Mexico was colonized in 1598. That's something. The East Coast is way behind the curve when it comes to what was done in our state. And I just think it's tragic that we do that. Now, I'm sure that educators are going to have their reasons for all that. But from a very selfish point of view, I think it's just a terrible mistake not to acquaint people with. We've got the cultures that we've had in this state we've had the Pueblo people that date back to the year 1000 in this state that we rarely ever talk about, the Mimbres people and so forth. All of those are great topics for our citizens, but we don't deal with it in schools. Unless I'm mistaken, you can go all the way through our public schools and you have one semester of New Mexico history in junior high school and one more semester in high school, and that's it. And I think that's just really too bad.
Well, that's a whole year, though, 2 semesters. That's quite a bit for one state. I mean, we have U.S. history, international history, but that's quite a bit.
Yeah,
I mean, you love history, so you'd like more.
But by comparison, you go to Texas, and they have a whole curricula on Texas history. Ask a Texan. You're going to have Jim Jones in here in a little while, who's a Texan. Ask him about Texas history and see what he says compared to what we do.
But again, at the University of New Mexico, if they go on to college, their classes. So we don't have that much history, but we can get it from the New Mexico Westerners. But what else would you like to share about our history to our audience now, Don Bullis?
In general, New Mexico history?
What makes it so fascinating to you? Remarkable.
Well, I think anybody that's curious about, I mean, if you want to think about where we are now in terms of our political situation and so forth, you really can't consider that unless you know something about where we've been. And if you don't, then you're just fooling yourself. You're just listening to words from people. You don't know what they mean, what they're based on, and so forth.
To you, Don Bullis, what does the Wild West mean? And are we still living in the Wild West? Give me your definition, and I'm going to ask you that as well, Joe. What does the Wild West mean?
Well, the Wild West was a fiction created by Hollywood.
Okay, so
the West was the West. It was the American frontier, and being the frontier implies lots of things. There was certainly extreme difficulty. There were cultural clashes that we lived with. Actually, going back to the 16th century, the clashes between the newly arrived Europeans and the indigenous people that were obviously already here. I mean, it's just an incredible span of things, and I really believe that if you don't know something about New Mexico's history, you really don't know very much about New Mexico, because you're only looking at the superficial part of it if you don't look into what's under the superficial.
Are we still living in the Wild West here in New Mexico?
Well, you could argue that, I suppose, but
people do. I mean, on the streets of downtown Albuquerque.
You know, historians can't even agree on when the frontier was closed. There are those that believe that the frontier closed when barbed wire was introduced in the early 1880s. Others say it wasn't closed until the turn of the century in 1901. And still others believe that it didn't end until statehood. But if you want to look at some events that took place in rural New Mexico after that, it's still pretty wild. So, you know, those are things that you can't make hard and fast declarations about. Well, frontier closed when the first strand of barbed wire was put up. Well, that's not really true. But that's an example of how, you know, history, perceptions of history are a fluid thing. History doesn't change, but the perceptions of it do change.
What's your favorite thing? We have a few minutes left, Don Bullis. What's your, I mean, there's so many, but just asking again to educate our audience, what is the most unique, fascinating thing you think about our history? Well, I think it's like the shootouts, the lawmen, the saloons, and all, you know, what I've seen in Western movies. But to you, what is the most interesting?
Well, you know, there are lots of things you could identify, but I think one of the most interesting is the Mexican period. We were under Mexican rule from 1821 to 1846. That's only 25 years. But it was a transition period between Spanish rule. And Spanish rule was a closed society. The Spaniards didn't allow any interaction outside of Nuevo Mexico, which is what they called it. But then when the Mexican era came in, they opened the doors and allowed trade to begin with the United States. So the transition there, not just in the economy, there was a huge transmission in the church. The Catholic Church changed a lot between 1821 and 1846. The culture was changing because the Santa Fe Trail opened in 1821. Thousands of Anglo-Protestants moved into a state that was largely Roman Catholic. That's bound to cause changes, but not only that, a clash. There has to be a big difference in all that. So, I mean, that's one of the most important areas. I've done some research on it, done some talks on it, and so
1821 to 1846. That's
1846, 25 years.
That's a rich period of time.
Right. Yep.
Evolving.
Yep.
Was it the Wild West back then? Or was that before?
It was the difficult West, I'd put it that way. Life was very hard on the frontier.
I often think when the winds whip up in the spring here and the cold, how did people survive? I mean, we have in this modern age, I'm thinking this is just miserable and cold. How did people out in that frontier survive those winds?
Well, think about living in a 2-room adobe house 50 miles from the closest town, without electricity, without telephones, without any running water. And you know what your life amounted to in those days? You only had 2 things that really mattered to you. That was working, surviving, and your church was the other. That's because the church was always there. One of the things that happened in New Mexico, you didn't have a village spring up until pretty soon there was a priest there. So that was it. Another interesting factor, though, is as we evolved into towns of the Old West, it expanded a little bit. You know what else came?
The saloons.
Saloons, exactly right.
That's what I know about.
Almost immediately, there was a.
Sometimes
the saloons were first.
First it was a church, and then the saloon came.
Right.
1 church, 4 saloons.
Right.
Oh. Don, please come back. And come back and talk about the Unsolved. What else do we have? The books: New Mexico the historical biography, New Mexico historical encyclopedia. So much. Would you please come back on our show?
Certainly will.
And I know that Joe Brown, wealth of information. Joe brought Don to us today, and Joe is going to be on other shows to talk. So you say, why did Joe get to talk? Well, you're going to get your share.
Oh.
But
absolutely.
Thank you so much. And lastly, with just 30 seconds to go, again, Joe Brown, the Vice President of the New Mexico Westerners, what would you like to share with our audience? How can they get some contact information?
Well, I tell you what I'm going to do, and I don't do this very often.
Oh, and we got 10 seconds.
But you can send something to jbrown2452@yahoo.com. That's my email, and I will give you what you need.
Very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater is presented as a public service to New Mexicans by State Employees Credit Union, which has proudly been serving the families in New Mexico locally and abroad since 1958. State Employees Credit Union is ready to help you and your family with all your financial goals and is the exclusive sponsor of Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater in order to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. To comment on today's program or to purchase a DVD copy of any Issues and Answers program, visit sunbroadcasting.org or call us at 505-345-1991.